Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Winter has finally reared its head here in Queensland, and with that weather, the cold weather, I've been cozying up with some beloved stories. And I've been particularly thinking about the work of Thomas Hardy. I have here my copy of Far from the Madding Crowd, one of my absolute favorites. And who doesn't love the 2015 film starring Carey Mulligan and Matthias Schoedenarts? I mean, it's just so swoon-worthy. It's a wonderful story. But considering Thomas Hardy, I've been wondering to myself, is Thomas Hardy a feminist or a flop? So Thomas Hardy is considered one of the most beloved authors of all time, an English novelist in the Victorian period. He is famous for his stunning descriptions of nature and his sympathetic treatment of his working class characters. And it's no wonder, therefore, that his work has struck a chord with people for generations. His personal life, however, was very troubled, and while Hardy worked to destroy a lot of his personal letters and diaries, he left so many clues in his writing, which always reflected what was happening in his life. And when you learn about this man's life, it is so obvious that the inspiration for tales of the working class in a beautiful expanse of southwestern England and strong, fiery women with tragic circumstances, these all come directly from his own life. Now, in this video, I want to discuss whether Thomas Hardy truly fits the bill as a proto-feminist, as he is often labeled in the academic world. He loved and cared for women. It's very obvious in his writing. He saw them as human, and he wanted more for them in a society that saw them as lesser than. However, there is a massive gap between what he wrote and how he lived his life. To illustrate this, I want to discuss the life of Thomas Hardy and that of the three women who had the most influence on his life: his mother, Jemima, his first wife, Emma Gifford, and his second wife, Florence Emily Dugdale. And furthermore, I hope to explain how Victorian society at the time left all three of these women in rather disadvantageous circumstances. And lastly, how Hardy's own flaws and imperfections caused a schism between what he wrote and claimed to believe and how he actually lived his life. So to do that, let's dive in, discuss the life of Thomas Hardy, the women who influenced him, and the fact that even proto-feminists are not perfect. By today's standards, Thomas Hardy could never measure up to the social justice warriors that we see online. But for the time, his writing was so groundbreaking. He wrote about things that were not only not discussed, they were absolutely scandalous. But that schism that I mentioned always remained between the values that he portrayed in his writing and what he actually did. It's almost like his heart and mind were in two separate places. I'll come back to that idea, but first let's dive into the life of Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy was born in Dorset, UK, and was very working class. His father was a builder and his mother worked as a servant. Now, his mother, Jemima, had a massive influence on Hardy. Although she herself was from working class stock, she was fiercely proud and independent. She knew the importance of education, and at a time where many working class people were illiterate, some of her own favorite books were Paradise Lost and The Pilgrim's Progress. She had a passion for music and folk tales, and she could spin a great yarn in the oral tradition. In the evening, she would tell Hardy and his siblings stories of her own experience. These were stories of the hard life in the countryside, of what it meant to be human, of birth, death, love, and loss. Additionally, because of her own impoverished upbringing, she demanded success from her children and pushed them to be as educated as they could be. Because of this, Thomas Hardy began his schooling at Mr. Lass Academy for Young Gentlemen. For 6 years, he walked 3 miles each way to school, just like your granddad's stories. And this was at the behest of his mother, who thus far is the most important woman in his life. Her insistence that Hardy be educated meant that he would undertake this massive walk every day, and this walk planted the seeds for his great love of nature. Here on this walk, he was subject to the changing of the seasons. He walked to and from school alone every day and became intimate with his surroundings. As he trod past farmlands and paddocks, he also witnessed the nonstop efforts of the working farmers of Dorset. These farmhands and laborers were the characters that he would one day write about with such depth and respect. And here's a really interesting tidbit. So some of these farm girls, they would eventually get to know Hardy. They saw him walking past every day, get to know him a little bit. And many of them were illiterate, of course. And so his first job, some of them would pay him, a shilling or whatever to help them write love letters to their beaux. Now, if you've read Hardy at all, this is all sounding very familiar. Tales of the countryside and a deep affinity for nature, and of course, love stories. Hardy was by all accounts a shy, sensitive, quiet person, but he had a great, enormous capacity for love. And this is, of course, best illustrated in his relationship with his first wife, Emma Gifford. So we've now come to the second woman in his life. Fast forward a little bit, he's grown up now. So Hardy and Emma Gifford first met when he had finished school. He was working as a draftsman for an architect. Hardy was sent to survey a church in the countryside and to start its restoration. And there on this trip, he met Emma. And in many ways, she was his diametric opposite. Basically, he met a baddie. I mean, he called her lioness. She was from a much higher class family than he was. She was sassy and outgoing, and despite all their differences, the two of them hit it off. Now, during this time, Hardy wasn't really writing. He had tried his hand before and been rejected by publishers, and he thought the best course of action right now is just to work for the architect and forget about writing. It's not going to work out. But that meeting with Emma stoked the fire for his creative pursuits. He began writing prolifically again, and the two of them shared this passion for creative writing. And furthermore, that meeting and the love that he felt for her sparked this massive creative flare in him. However, sadly, tragically, the match was doomed from the start. Years later, when he finally worked up the courage to ask Emma's father for her hand in marriage, it did not go well. We don't know exactly what was said between these two men, but we do know that Hardy went home dejected. Now, at this point, he decided to take a big risk. He ditched the drafting career. He moved to London to write full time. And this is where he created what is considered his first great masterpiece, Far from the Madding Crowd. And it's important to note that once again, by Victorian standards, Hardy's novels were scandalous. Ooh! They featured wild, dramatic storylines, strong women who rode their horses astride, which was inspired by Emma Gifford, who was quite the horsewoman. Stories of tragedy and unspeakable sin. But as you can imagine, that scandal also made for great raging success. After the success of Far From the Madding Crowd, Thomas Hardy finally had the means to marry his beloved Emma Gifford. Their families disapproved. They did not attend the wedding, and they basically became estranged from their families after this. Now, as you might know, if you have read the work of Thomas Hardy, Far From the Madding Crowd is one of his few works that has a happy ending. It takes a lot of drama and a lot of tragedy to get there, but it is by all means a positive and hopeful ending. Hardy's personal life was always reflected in his work, as I said, and in those days, he was a hopeful man. His writing career was taking off. He had a new bride who loved and supported him. He did not know what lay around the corner. There was trouble brewing in his marriage, and the London life was getting to him. He moved back to Dorset with Emma near the cottage where he was born, and here he, his brother, and his father worked together to build his home, which he called Max Gate. Now, what was the issue with the marriage? At the start, Emma believed that she would have this supporting role in his writing. She also had a passion for writing, and she had this idea that being from upper class stock, she could be the one who, discovered Hardy and gave him his success. However, Hardy didn't see things that way. He was working day and night with the door closed, and she was not invited in. And Emma, this high-bred Victorian woman, was sort of left not knowing what to do with herself. And worse, she was brewing a deep resentment for the man that she was supposed to love. It's also important to remember, as I said at the beginning of this video, these are complicated, real, imperfect people. And Hardy believed himself to be a realist, but I think that there's always this gap between the reality he's portraying in his writing and the reality that he's living. There's this strange paradox where he's writing about the things that happen in his life, but the values that he portrays are not always upheld by himself. It's in part, he's human and no one's perfect, but it's also part of society and the circumstances. It is what it is. Hardy was being lauded. He was invited to parties and made part of the important literary set of London where they often traveled, but Emma was not. They both wanted children, and for one reason or another, it didn't happen. Emma didn't know what her place was, and worse yet, she began to suspect that Hardy's affections were turning to other women. Because of all this, she became increasingly difficult to live with. She shut herself up in the attic of Max Gate. She wrote cruel letters to Hardy's family, blaming them for the way things had turned out. And people around them began to accuse her of being mad. Thus, Hardy's work became increasingly melancholy. Things came to a real head with the publication of Jude the Obscure, which was over the line. It was too much. It was too scandalous for Victorian society. And if you even read it today, it's a lot. It's dark, it's a lot. His work was so harshly critiqued, he chose to stop writing novels altogether. Instead, he set himself to focus on poetry. Again, his poems reflected his thoughts, his values, and his fantasies. He loved Dorset, he loved the countryside, and of course, women, or at least the idea of women. And unfortunately, he did indeed begin an affair with his secretary, Florence Emily Dugdale. So here we are at number 3, the third woman in Thomas Hardy's life. Hardy and his wife Emma had grown so much apart that even though they lived under the same roof, they hardly saw one another. And one fateful day, the maid came downstairs to tell Hardy that the mistress was quite ill. Reluctantly, Thomas Hardy went upstairs to check on her and found she was already dead. He buried his wife next to his mother, the two women who had so much influence on his life and who were so opposed to each other, now lay side by side in death. He tried to relive the time of their meeting and courtship. He took a trip to Cornwall where they met, and he obsessed over every detail, every landscape, every place where they had spent time together. He wrote of seeing there a ghost girl rider. His calendar on his desk thenceforth was set to the 7th of March, the day that he and Emma had met. It was as though he could not stop living in the past at this point. He was completely hung up on his late wife, and more specifically, the early days in which they met and their subsequent courtship. Despite this fixation, 2 years after the death of Emma, he married his secretary, Florence Emily Dugdale. She was the one with whom he was having an affair before Emma died. And furthermore, she was 39 years his junior. Okay, I know some of you are going to be really upset by this. You're reeling. You're going, how can anyone call this man a feminist? And okay, proto-feminist, right? And also, as I said, this illustrates the gap between what he wrote in his books and what he actually did. So Florence was his secretary. She also wrote children's books, and she was, in a way, a more suitable lady for what was acceptable by Victorian standards. However, she had to suffer the great embarrassment of being married to this famous author who, by all accounts, is a household name at this point, while he's obsessively writing about his dead first wife. It was a torment to her. She was embarrassed. Have a strong mother who disapproves of her son's marriage and all but disowns him. We have a fiery first wife who is his true love, but he couldn't offer her a real, tangible, and meaningful relationship. He was just in love with the idea of her. And we also have his second wife who fits the bill for society's standards, but she has to live in the shadow of his first wife. So this is the schism between what he wrote and what he did, in the same way that he was torn between the high society of London that wanted him in the inner circle and his beloved home of Dorset. In the same way he wanted to expose the struggles of the working class and women without properly caring for the woman in his own life. It really is like his heart and mind were in two different places. Now, with all this said, here's a really interesting little tidbit about Hardy's death. At the beginning of 1928, and after a long battle with illness, Hardy passed away in his home at Max Gate. Hardy wished to be buried in Dorset with his first wife Emma and with his mother and, at his family plot. But the executor of his will insisted that he needed to be buried at Poets Abbey at Westminster in London. Now, once again, he's torn between two places. So what does the doctor who prepared his body do? He literally cut out the heart of Thomas Hardy and gave it to his maid so that the heart could be buried in Dorset with his family, while the rest of the body was interred at Poets Abbey. His heart and mind could not be in sync, even in death. So all of this goes to show, well, first of all, people are complicated, and his works are still beloved today, and he's received numerous accolades, but he was an imperfect person. He may be considered a proto-feminist, but by 2026 standards, he's pretty far off the mark. His writings express this love for women and a sympathy for their struggles and a wish for a better world for them. But he didn't seem to be able to contribute to that better world in his personal life. That being said, He really did contribute to a better world for women worldwide. His writings started conversations that were not had in that day. Shedding light on the darkness is how we begin to heal, and Hardy put down some of the foundation stones for important feminist work. As academics say, we stand on the shoulders of giants. It's someone had to put those first stones down, and while they didn't finish the castle, they still played an important role. What else can we learn from this? Don't let your heart and mind be out of sync like this. Don't let them be separate. They can often be at odds with each other or contradict each other, yes, but if you can't make them friends, at least make them allies. And furthermore, do not let the idea of a person be your guiding force. We're all complex, flawed, and very real humans, but allowing yourself to only love the idea of someone will only lead to tragedy. This is one of the numerous faults with, the manosphere or the tradwife movement, any of these ridiculous extremist ideas that we see online today. They treat women as a whole as a concept. These so-called philosophies will never lead you to true human connection because human connection is ephemeral, individual, and genuine. What works for one relationship won't work for another. We are no longer bound by the confines of Victorian society. We have so much potential as a species to do good for ourselves and for each other. And so I entreat you, set aside your ideals and obsessions for a moment. Get your heart and mind in line with each other. When you approach another person as a complicated, imperfect human being like yourself, you've dropped the illusion and suddenly you can truly connect. Unlike Thomas Hardy, you can experience real connection with your heart and mind so long as you understand and respect that the heart and mind of another will not be exactly the same as yours. So that is my video, part one of, Thomas Hardy's works. There's a lot here. You could talk about his religious ideas. I would love to make a whole video about Emma Gifford because she also was a writer and she had her own life. And so there's a lot going on here. Anyways, I hope you like this video. Smash that like button, subscribe, comment, all that stuff, and I'll see you later. Bye.